Are you waiting for closure from someone who hurt you? Maybe it was a friend, a family member, a coworker, a boyfriend, a spouse, or someone you trusted. And maybe you convinced yourself that if you could just have one conversation, one explanation, one apology, you could finally move on. Then you'd have peace. But what if that is not true? Let's talk about it. Hey friends, my name is Daira and welcome to the conversation on faith, relationships, and everything in between. So grab your coffee and let's begin. So today we are talking about closure. Yes, can I tell you something that I've been thinking about for a long time? I think closure might be one of the most overrated ideas out there. Not because apologies aren't meaningful and not because conversations can't help, but because we have convinced ourselves that peace lives on the other side of someone else's response. I've watched way too many true crime documentaries over the years, and one thing always stands out to me. You see families waiting years, sometimes decades, for justice, and they sit through court hearings and appeals, believing that when the process is finally over, they'll have peace. But then the day comes, justice is served, the chapter is technically closed, and yet many of them walk away saying, I thought I would feel different. Why? Because you see, the grief is still there, the loss is still there, and the wound is still there. If closure doesn't heal me, then what does? Well, a conversation that you've rehearsed 100 times in your head. We tell ourselves that when we finally have that conversation, we'll be okay. But what if closure is getting too much credit? Because here's what I've learned. You can get the apology and still feel hurt. You can get the explanation and still feel confused. You can get the conversation and actually still not have peace. For a long time, I thought I needed answers. I thought I needed people to explain themselves, acknowledge what they had done, and somehow it would make sense of what happened. What I eventually realized was that the people who hurt us are the least qualified people to heal us. And that's why I want to spend the rest of our time talking about how to find peace instead of closure, because I believe that's what we're really after. But before we jump in, if this conversation encourages you in any way, type the word joy in the comments below, and I will send you a free PDF of my book, Honest to Goodness Joy. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Every week we have conversations just like this one. So, how do we move forward? All right, number one, stop replaying the event. Think about how often we relive our pain. We replay the conversation, the text message, the betrayal, the moment everything changed. The event happened once, but in our minds, we're allowing it to happen over and over again. The Apostle Paul talks about this in the Bible in 2 Corinthians 10:5, and he says to take every thought captive. I love that imagery because it means we don't simply let a thought run wild. We stop it, we challenge it, we redirect it. When I find myself replaying a hurtful situation, I try to catch it as quickly as possible and replace it with something else. Sometimes I thank God for some specific blessing in my life. Sometimes I pray for that person. Sometimes I intentionally focus on a good memory. Anything is better than giving the hurt another hour of free rent in your mind. Because every time you replay the wound, you're reopening it, and at some point, healing requires us to stop visiting the scene of the crime. So, number two, let go of the version of the person you wished existed. Now, this one is hard because if we're honest, many of us are not waiting for closure. We're waiting for a different version of the person who hurt us. We're waiting for them to become self aware, to finally understand the damage that they caused, or to become mature enough to apologize. And sometimes that happens, but oftentimes it does not. One of the most freeing moments in my life came when I stopped expecting certain people to give me something they had never shown me or they weren't capable of giving me. Not because I became bitter, not because I stopped loving them, but because I accepted the reality. And there is freedom in that reality. Healing begins when we stop waiting for someone else to change because we allow ourselves to move forward. And number three, look for God's purpose instead of the explanation. For years, I wanted answers. Why did they do that? But eventually, I realized that even if I got an answer I wanted, it wouldn't change what had happened. The disappointment and the loss would still be real. What I needed wasn't more information. What I needed was a different perspective. That's what happened with Joseph in the Bible, and it changed everything about his story. Now, if anyone had a right to demand closure, it would have been Joseph. To summarize his life events, his brothers betrayed him, sold him into slavery, and changed the course of his life forever. And even when he was faithful in Potiphar's house, and then he was thrown into jail, and people said they wouldn't forget him, but they did, he didn't let it define his worth. When Joseph finally stood before the very people who had hurt him, his brothers, and eventually was in control of all of Egypt, he wasn't focused on what they had done. He was focused on what God had done. That's why he could say, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Joseph didn't deny the pain. He didn't excuse the betrayal. He simply refused to let it become the defining thing about his story. And I think that's one of the most powerful shifts we can make. Instead of looking for their explanation, start looking for God's purpose, because one keeps you stuck in the past and the other helps move you forward to a better future. The reality is that some questions will never be answered, some conversations will never happen, and some apologies will never come. But peace doesn't have to wait for those things. Peace begins the moment you stop asking the person who wounded you to become the person who heals you. That is not their job. So, if you've been waiting for closure, maybe today is the day you can stop standing at that door. Maybe today is the day you can stop giving someone else the power and you can just choose peace. Because closure may never come, but peace can start today. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to move on and you didn't get that apology or that explanation or conversation you hoped for? Let me know in the comments. And if this message encouraged you, type joy below and I'll send you a free copy of my book, Honest to Goodness Joy. I read all your comments and I pray for all of you, so I'm grateful you're here and I can't wait to see you next time.